I still remember the cold silence that greeted me when I walked into Preston and Associates law firm, 15 minutes late for what I didn't know was my grandfather's will reading. My cousins and aunts were already seated in the mahogany-furnished conference room, their expressions hardening as I entered. No one had bothered to inform me about the meeting time change. It was only when Mr. Preston, the family attorney, looked up and said, "Ah, Ms. Morgan, we've been waiting for the majority shareholder," that everything in the room, including my understanding of my place in the family, completely shifted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My relationship with the Morgan family had always been complicated. As the only child of Robert Morgan, the black sheep who'd left the family business to pursue art and waste his potential, according to my grandfather Harold, I'd grown up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town from the sprawling Morgan estate where my cousins were raised. My father died when I was 19, leaving me with student loans, his collection of half-finished paintings, and the persistent feeling that I needed to prove myself worthy of the Morgan name, despite having chosen a career in education rather than business. Grandpa Harold had built Morgan Developments from nothing, transforming it from a small construction company into one of the largest commercial real estate developers in the Pacific Northwest. His 3 children, my father Robert, my uncle Philip, and my aunt Veronica, had been groomed from birth to continue his legacy. But while Philip and Veronica had embraced their roles in the company, my father had walked away, creating a rift that never healed despite my many childhood attempts to bridge it. Growing up, I spent most holidays at the periphery of family gatherings, watching my cousins receive lavish gifts and meaningful attention while I received impersonal gift cards and thinly veiled comments about how I might still turn my life around and join the family business. My cousin Eliza, Aunt Veronica's oldest daughter, had taken particular delight in reminding me of my outsider status at every opportunity. "Emma, darling," she would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How's the finger painting going? It must be so fulfilling teaching art to children who can't afford real lessons." I had spent years perfecting the art of the polite smile in response, never giving her the satisfaction of seeing how deeply her words cut. My job as an art teacher at Greenfield Academy, a school serving primarily low-income students, was something I was genuinely proud of, even if my grandfather had dismissed it as charity work masquerading as a career. When Grandpa Harold became ill 6 months ago, I had visited regularly despite the uncomfortable atmosphere. I would bring fresh flowers and sit beside his bed, telling him about my students' art projects while he drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes, in his more lucid moments, he would look at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between regret and evaluation. During my last visit, he had gripped my hand with surprising strength. "You remind me of your grandmother," he'd said, his voice raspy. She had the same stubborn integrity. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given me, and I had treasured it during the weeks that followed, through his rapid decline and eventual passing. The funeral had been a somber affair where I stood several rows back, separated from the real family as usual. Eliza had managed the arrangements with her typical efficiency, making it clear through subtle cues that I was welcome to attend, but not to participate. My role was to be visible, but not central, present enough to avoid gossip about family discord, but not so present as to suggest I had any meaningful place in the Morgan legacy. Which is why the attorney's words, "majority shareholder," struck me with the force of a physical blow. "I'm sorry, what?" I stammered, still standing awkwardly by the door, my rain-damp coat clutched in my hands. Mr. Preston cleared his throat and gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit down, Ms. Morgan. As I was explaining to your family, your grandfather made some rather significant changes to his will in the months before his passing." I slid into the indicated seat, acutely aware of the hostile stares from around the table. Aunt Veronica's perfectly manicured nails tapped an agitated rhythm on the polished wood. Uncle Philip's face had flushed to a concerning shade of red. And Eliza looked as though she might actually combust from contained fury. As I was saying, Mr. Preston continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Harold Morgan has divided his estate as follows. The Morgan family home and its contents go to Philip and Veronica Morgan, to be shared equally. His liquid assets, approximately $12 million, are to be divided among his grandchildren in equal portions. He paused, allowing this information to settle before delivering the bombshell. However, with regard to Morgan Developments, Mr. Morgan has made a rather unprecedented decision. 60% of the company shares are to be transferred to Emma Morgan, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, as if everyone in the room had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. I felt dizzy, certain I had misheard. "This has to be a mistake," Eliza finally said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Emma has no experience in business. She's an art teacher, for God's sake. She's never shown the slightest interest in the company." Mr. Preston's expression remained neutral. "I assure you, Ms. Collins, this is no mistake. I personally discussed these changes with Mr. Morgan at length. He was of sound mind and quite adamant about his wishes." Uncle Philip slammed his fist on the table, causing everyone to jump. "This is absurd. I've dedicated my entire life to this company, 35 years, and Veronica has been there every step of the way. We built Morgan Developments into what it is today while Robert was off playing with paintbrushes." "With all due respect," Mr. Preston replied, unfazed by the outburst, "Harold was quite clear that while you and Veronica have been instrumental in the company's success, the final decisions were always his, and his final decision was to leave, controlling interest to Emma." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "But why? He never even—" I swallowed hard. "He never indicated that he wanted me involved in the business." Mr. Preston reached into his briefcase and withdrew an envelope. "He left this for you. He asked that you read it privately." The letter burned in my hand like a live coal as the meeting continued around me. Mr. Preston detailed the remainder of the will: charitable donations, provisions for longtime staff, smaller bequests to distant relatives. But I barely heard any of it. My attention fixed on my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting across the envelope. As soon as the formal reading concluded, Aunt Veronica approached me, her expression carefully composed despite the tight lines around her mouth. "Emma, dear, we should discuss this. Unexpected development. Perhaps over dinner tonight? The family needs to present a united front during this transition." Before I could respond, Eliza cut in. "United front? Are you serious, Mother? She's not even part of this family in any real sense. She shows up to holiday dinners and funerals, but where has she been for all the shareholder meetings, the strategic planning sessions, the client crisis management at 3 a.m? "Eliza," Veronica warned, but her daughter was beyond restraint. "No, this is ridiculous. She has an art degree and spends her days helping underprivileged kids make papier-mâché. Meanwhile, I have an MBA from Wharton and have been groomed to take over this company since I was in high school." She turned to me, eyes flashing. "What exactly do you think you're going to do with a majority stake in a $500 million company, Emma? Redecorate the boardroom with finger paintings?" The familiar heat of humiliation rose in my cheeks, but something else rose alongside it, a simmering anger that had been building for years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "But I do know that I won't make any decisions until I've read my grandfather's letter and taken some time to think." "How convenient," Eliza sneered. "Take all the time you need. The company will be in ruins by the time you figure out which end of a financial statement to read first." "That's enough," Uncle Philip interjected, his business instincts apparently overriding his personal feelings. This isn't the time or place. We'll discuss this as a family. As a family. The phrase struck me as darkly comical given their consistent message over the years that I wasn't really one of them. Yet now, with 60% of Morgan Development suddenly in my control, I was family enough to warrant inclusion. I gathered my belongings, including the mysterious envelope, and made my excuses. The weight of their stares followed me out of the conference room, down the elevator, and into the rainy afternoon. My hands shook as I fumbled with my umbrella, not from fear, but from the overwhelming tide of emotions surging through me. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and underneath it all, a strange sense of vindication I wasn't ready to examine. My small apartment felt like a sanctuary when I finally arrived home. I kicked off my damp shoes, made a cup of strong tea, and settled on my worn but comfortable sofa, the envelope resting unopened on the coffee table before me. For nearly an hour, I simply stared at it, afraid of what it might contain. What possible explanation could my grandfather have for this 11th-hour reversal? Was it some final test? A punishment for my father that had transferred to me? Or something else entirely? Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery bearing my grandfather's monogrammed letterhead. His handwriting, once bold and commanding, had become shakier in his final months, but the force of his personality still resonated through every carefully formed word. Emma, if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of time to say in person what should have been said years ago. First, I owe you an apology. The rift between your father and me was never about you, yet you've borne its consequences your entire life. I allowed my pride and disappointment to blind me to the remarkable person you've become, someone with Robert's creativity, but also with a strength of character and purpose that reminds me painfully of your grandmother. During your visits these past months, I've seen what the rest of the family has been too self-absorbed to notice. You possess the one quality that has ensured Morgan Development's success through market crashes and recessions: the ability to see value where others see only liability. Your work with those children, transforming their challenges into opportunities for creative expression, reveals a kind of visionary thinking that cannot be taught at business school. I'm not giving you this company as a gift or an inheritance. I'm entrusting it to you as its best hope for the future. Philip and Veronica have maintained what I built, but they've never had the courage to truly innovate. Eliza sees the business as nothing more than a vehicle for power and prestige. You, with your outsider's perspective and your artist's eye, will see possibilities they cannot. You may choose to sell your shares and walk away. That is your right. But before you decide, I ask that you spend 6 months at the company, learn its operations, meet its people, understand its potential. Then, and only then, make your decision. I have arranged for Thomas Chen, our Chief Financial Officer, to serve as your guide. Unlike the rest of the executive team, he has no family allegiance to cloud his judgment. He will show you the truth of the company, both its strengths and the serious problems it now faces. Yes, Emma, despite appearances, Morgan Development stands at a crossroads. The path forward requires exactly the kind of fresh perspective that you, and only you, can provide. I regret many things as I reach the end of my life, but none more than the years of connection with you that my stubbornness cost us. I cannot reclaim that time, but perhaps this opportunity might lead to a different kind of legacy, one built on seeing clearly, rather than seeing only what we wish to see. The choice, as always, is yours. Your grandfather, Harold Morgan. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words on my final reading. All those years of feeling judged and found wanting, of believing my grandfather saw me as nothing more than a disappointment carrying my father's legacy of rebellion. And all along, he had been watching, evaluating, seeing something in me that I hadn't even fully recognized in myself. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. Aunt Veronica insisting on dinner. Uncle Philip demanding a meeting with the executive team. Eliza sending thinly veiled threats about legal challenges to the will. I silenced it and placed it face down on the coffee table. Tomorrow would bring confrontations and decisions. Tonight, I needed to sit with this new reality and all its implications. The thought of walking into Morgan Developments as its majority shareholder was terrifying. I knew nothing about commercial real estate development. My financial expertise extended to managing my teacher's salary and modest savings. The executives would see me as an interloper, the employees as a punchline. And my family, the family that had never truly accepted me, would be watching for any misstep, any sign of weakness or incompetence that might justify challenging my grandfather's decision. Yet beneath the fear ran a current of something unexpected, curiosity, perhaps even excitement. What had my grandfather seen in me that made him take such a dramatic risk? What were these serious problems facing the company that required a fresh perspective? And who was this Thomas Chen who supposedly held the keys to understanding my inheritance? As night fell outside my window, I made two decisions. First, I would accept my grandfather's challenge to spend 6 months learning the business before making any irreversible choices. Second, I would meet with this Thomas Chen before confronting the rest of the family. If he was to be my guide through this unfamiliar territory, I needed to determine whether he was truly the neutral party my grandfather had described, or just another obstacle in my path. With those decisions made, I should have felt some resolution, some sense of a path forward. Instead, I felt the vertiginous sensation of having stepped off a precipice, uncertain whether I was about to fly or fall. The familiar contours of my life, my small apartment, my teaching position, my carefully maintained distance from the Morgan family drama, suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's existence. My father had walked away from his inheritance, choosing artistic freedom over wealth and position. Now I faced the opposite choice, stepping into a world he had rejected, taking on a responsibility I had never sought or prepared for. Was I honoring his memory or betraying it? Was I claiming my birthright or surrendering my hard-won independence? The questions circled endlessly as the night deepened around me. But underneath them all lay the most unsettling question of all. What if my grandfather was right? What if I actually could see possibilities that others missed? What if the skills I'd developed teaching art to struggling students really could translate to saving a $500 million company from whatever crisis it secretly faced? It seemed absurd, yet a small voice inside me, a voice that sounded strangely like my father's, whispered, "Maybe the ability to reimagine the world isn't just artistic indulgence. Maybe it's exactly what a stagnant business needs." I fell asleep on the sofa with my grandfather's letter clutched to my chest, dreaming of boardrooms where the walls transformed into canvases and spreadsheets that rearranged themselves into mosaics of possibility. Morning brought reality crashing, back in the form of 17 missed calls, 28 text messages, and an email from Mr. Preston requesting confirmation of my availability for an orientation session at Morgan Development's headquarters the following day. Apparently, my grandfather had left detailed instructions about the transition process, including my introduction to key personnel and systems. I called in a substitute teacher for my classes, explaining that a family emergency required my attention for at least the next few days. Then I did something I'd never done before. I searched online for information about Thomas Chen, the man my grandfather had designated as my guide through this unfamiliar territory. The results were illuminating. Thomas had joined Morgan Developments 5 years ago after a distinguished career at several larger development firms in New York and Chicago. His specialization was in sustainable urban development and adaptive reuse of historical properties, approaches that were innovative for a traditional company like Morgan. The business press had noted his hiring as a surprising move for a firm known for its conservative approach. Several articles speculated that he represented a new direction for the company, though subsequent years had shown little evidence of such a shift. More interestingly, there was no obvious connection between Thomas and my family. He wasn't a longtime friend of my grandfather's, hadn't attended the same schools as any Morgans, and didn't appear in any social media photos at family events. If my grandfather had wanted someone without established loyalties to guide me, Thomas did indeed seem like a logical choice. After a quick shower and breakfast, I stood before my closet facing a surprisingly difficult decision. What does one wear to meet a family that has suddenly become both relatives and business adversaries? My wardrobe consisted primarily of comfortable, creative clothes, suitable for an art classroom where paint splatters were an occupational hazard. The few dressier items I owned were nowhere near the standard I knew would be expected at Morgan Developments, where even administrative assistants dressed in designer brands. In the end, I opted for a simple black dress, the one I'd worn to my grandfather's funeral, paired with a colorful scarf I'd hand-dyed in a workshop with my students. Professional enough to be taken seriously, but with a touch of artistic identity I refused to suppress. If I was going to navigate this new reality, I would do so authentically, or not at all. The Morgan Developments headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that the company had built a decade ago. The lobby featured a massive scale model of the city, with all Morgan properties illuminated from within, a physical manifestation of the company's outsized influence on our urban landscape. As I approached the security desk, I realized I had no idea what protocol to follow. Was I supposed to ask for Thomas Chen? Did I need some kind of credential to access the executive floors? Before I could stumble through an explanation, the security guard looked up, recognition flickering across his face. "Ms. Morgan, they're expecting you on the 32nd floor. Mr. Chen asked me to let him know when you arrived." He handed me a temporary access card. "This will get you to the executive level, the elevator on the far right." Apparently, news traveled fast. Or perhaps my grandfather's preparations had been more thorough than I'd realized. The elevator ride gave me 30 seconds of solitude to steady my nerves. The doors opened directly into a reception area, where a poised woman in her 50s greeted me with a professional smile that revealed nothing of her thoughts about this unusual situation. "Ms. Morgan, welcome to Morgan Developments. I'm Patricia, the executive floor coordinator. Mr. Chen is waiting for you in the founder's room." She led me down a corridor lined with framed photographs of the company's most significant projects. My grandfather appeared in many of them, looking progressively older as we moved chronologically toward the present. My father appeared in none. The founder's room turned out to be a warmly appointed meeting space rather than the imposing boardroom I had expected. A man I recognized from my online research stood as I entered. Thomas Chen was in his early 40s, with an understated elegance to his appearance and movement. "Ms. Morgan, thank you for coming. I know this must be an overwhelming time for you." "Please call me Emma," I said, accepting his offered handshake. And overwhelming doesn't begin to cover it. I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't an elaborate practical joke. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I can assure you it's quite real. Your grandfather and I discussed his plans extensively over the past year." That caught me by surprise. "A year? He's been planning this for that long?" Thomas gestured for me to take a seat at the small conference table. Harold was a methodical man who left little to chance. When his health began to decline, he started reassessing many aspects of his life and legacy. Your inheritance wasn't a deathbed decision. It was the result of careful consideration. I sank into the offered chair, trying to absorb this information. But why me? And why not tell me in advance? Give me some time to prepare, take some business classes, anything. Those are fair questions. Thomas took a seat across from me. As for why you, I think his letter probably addressed that better than I could. As for why the secrecy... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Your grandfather believed that certain elements within the company would have worked to undermine you if they'd known of his intentions. He wanted you to enter with the full legal authority of majority shareholder already established. Certain elements, I repeated. You mean my family? Family, yes, but also some members of the executive team who have grown comfortable with the status quo. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Emma, before we go any further, I need to know, have you decided whether you're accepting your grandfather's challenge? 6 months of learning the business before making any permanent decisions? The directness of the question forced me to commit to the decision I'd made the night before. Yes, I'll give it 6 months. I owe him that much at least. But I need to be honest, I know nothing about this business. Less than nothing, actually, since I've actively avoided learning about it my whole life. For the first time, Thomas smiled fully. That's exactly what your grandfather was counting on. He called it the advantage of the empty cup. No preconceptions, no attachment to how things have always been done. Or as we say in the art room, beginners have the freedom to try what masters know can't work. I smiled despite my nervousness. So what happens now? Now, we begin your education. Thomas reached for a tablet on the table and tapped it. A holographic display appeared above the surface, showing a complex organizational chart. This is Morgan Developments as it appears to the outside world. 5 divisions, 23 current projects, over 400 employees. Successful, stable, and entirely too cautious, according to your grandfather. With another tap, the display changed to show financial projections trending gradually downward. And this is Morgan Development's reality. Declining margins, increasing competition from more innovative firms, and a serious problem with our flagship development that has been carefully concealed from shareholders and the public. My stomach tightened. What kind of problem? The kind that could bankrupt the company if not addressed quickly and creatively. Thomas's expression was grave. The West Side Harbor development, the largest project in the company's history, has serious structural issues that were discovered after construction began. The previous chief engineer signed off on plans despite knowing about unstable soil conditions. He's since retired quite suddenly to a country with no extradition treaty. That sounds criminal, I said, alarmed. It likely was, but proving? It would mean publicly admitting the project is compromised, which would trigger contract penalties, investor lawsuits, and a public relations nightmare. Thomas switched off the holographic display. Your uncle and aunt have been pursuing a strategy of minimum disclosure and expensive Band-Aid solutions that are rapidly depleting the company's reserves. I sat back, trying to process the magnitude of what he was describing. So, my grandfather left me a majority stake in a company that's facing potential ruin? That's quite a gift. He left you an opportunity, Thomas corrected. He believed that someone with fresh eyes might see solutions that have been invisible to those too embedded in traditional approaches. Someone who understands transformation and creativity rather than just maintenance and incrementalism. That's a lot of faith to place in an art teacher, I said, unable to keep the doubt from my voice. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's exactly the kind of counterintuitive thinking that built this company in the first place. Thomas stood. Your grandfather wasn't always the conservative businessman you knew. In his early days, he was considered quite the maverick, taking risks others thought were madness, seeing potential in properties everyone else had written off. I thought of the framed photographs in the hallway, the younger version of my grandfather standing proudly beside developments that had transformed overlooked neighborhoods into vibrant communities. So what's next? I asked, standing as well. Next, we meet with the executive team, including your uncle and aunt. They've called an emergency session for 11 o'clock. Thomas checked his watch, which gives us about an hour to prepare you for what will undoubtedly be a challenging conversation. As we walked toward the main boardroom, I felt like an actor about to step on stage without having learned my lines. Yet underneath the anxiety ran a current of something that felt strangely like purpose. For the first time in my life, I was about to face the Morgan family, not as the disappointing offspring of the black sheep son, but as someone with power and responsibility of my own. Whether that power would be enough to save a company in crisis, and whether I possessed the skills my grandfather had mysteriously seen in me, remained to be seen. But as we approached the boardroom doors, I straightened my shoulders and touched the colorful scarf at my neck like a talisman. I might not know much about business, but I knew something about transformation. In my classroom, I had watched countless students discover new possibilities in materials others had discarded, new beauty and perspectives others had overlooked. Perhaps there was something to my grandfather's belief that these skills might translate to reimagining a company that had lost its way. The boardroom doors opened before us, revealing my family and a dozen executives seated around a massive table. Conversation stopped abruptly as all eyes turned to me, some curious, some hostile, all evaluating. Eliza's glare could have frozen flame. Uncle Philip's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. Aunt Veronica maintained a neutral expression that didn't quite disguise the calculation behind her eyes. Thomas stepped slightly ahead of me, his presence surprisingly reassuring. "Good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce Emma Morgan, Majority I, shareholder of Morgan Developments. As per Harold Morgan's explicit instructions, she will be taking an active role in company operations effective immediately." A moment of tense silence followed, broken by Uncle Philip's derisive laugh. Active role? She doesn't even know what EBITDA stands for. I stepped forward, drawing on every ounce of the confidence I used when facing a classroom of skeptical teenagers on the first day of school. "You're absolutely right, Uncle Philip. I have a lot to learn about this business." I placed my hands on the back of the chair at the head of the table, my grandfather's chair. "But I do know something about seeing potential where others see only problems. And from what I understand, that's exactly what Morgan Developments needs right now." The shock on their faces as I referenced the company's hidden crisis was worth every moment of discomfort I'd felt since walking into the lawyer's office the day before. Whatever came next, whether triumph or disaster, at least I had claimed my place at the table that had excluded me for so long. And that, as I often told my students when they faced seemingly impossible creative challenges, was always the first step toward transformation. The boardroom fell silent as I took my seat at the head of the table. For a moment, I allowed myself to absorb the surreal nature of the situation. Me, Emma Morgan, art teacher and perpetual family disappointment, sitting in the chair my grandfather had occupied for over 4 decades. The executive team watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. My family didn't bother to disguise their contempt. "This is absurd," Eliza finally said, breaking the silence. "We have actual business to discuss, not some remedial Finance 101 session for dear cousin Emma." Thomas Chen remained standing, his calm presence a counterbalance to the tension crackling through the room. "Ms. Collins, your grandfather specifically instructed that Emma be fully integrated into all company operations. That includes executive meetings." "My grandfather wasn't thinking clearly in his final months," Uncle Philip interjected. "Anyone who actually attended board meetings regularly would know that." The barb was aimed at me, of course, another reminder of my outsider status. "Your concerns about Harold's competency are noted," Thomas replied with practiced diplomacy. "However, Mr. Preston has confirmed that Harold underwent psychological evaluation immediately prior to changing his will. The results are part of the legal record and clearly establish his sound mental state." I fought to maintain a neutral expression, though internally I was grateful for Thomas's preparation. This challenge to Grandpa Harold's mental capacity had obviously been their first planned line of attack. "Perhaps we should begin with updates on current projects," Thomas suggested, smoothly taking control of the meeting. "Emma needs to understand the company's portfolio before making any decisions." For the next hour, I listened as division heads presented overviews of Morgan Development's various projects. I took careful notes, not pretending to understand all, the industry jargon but attentive to the patterns emerging beneath the surface. 3 executives seemed genuinely engaged in their work, describing challenges with authentic concern. The others delivered practiced presentations that felt hollow, emphasizing positive metrics while glossing over potential issues. Notably absent from all presentations was any substantive mention of Westside Harbor, the troubled development Thomas had identified as the company's greatest liability. When the last presenter finished, I cleared my throat. Thank you all for the overviews. They've been very informative. I kept my voice steady, channeling the confidence I used when addressing parents at school functions. I notice, however, that there seems to be limited discussion of Westside Harbor. Given that it represents our largest current investment, I'd appreciate a more detailed update. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Several executives exchanged glances. Uncle Philip's jaw tightened visibly. Westside Harbor is progressing according to revised timetables, he said dismissively. The project team can provide you with reports if you're interested in the minutiae. I am interested, I replied, holding his gaze, particularly in understanding the soil stability issues and their potential impact on the overall structural integrity of the development. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere down the table. Aunt Veronica's perfectly manicured hand froze midway through, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Uncle Philip's face flushed deep red. I don't know what you think you know about Westside Harbor, he said, voice dangerously low. But spreading unsubstantiated rumors about our flagship project would be extremely damaging. It's not a rumor if it's true, I countered, surprised by my own boldness. And concealing significant structural problems from investors and partners isn't just damaging, it's potentially criminal. The bomb I'd just dropped left the room in stunned silence. Eliza recovered first, her voice dripping with venom. 2 days as majority shareholder and already making wild accusations? This is exactly why everyone knows this inheritance was a terrible mistake. Thomas stepped in smoothly. Perhaps this would be a good time to adjourn the general meeting. Emma, I believe you wanted to review the Westside Harbor engineering reports this afternoon. Yes, I agreed, recognizing his attempt to de-escalate the situation. Let's reconvene when we have all the relevant facts before us. As the executives filed out, their hushed conversations betraying their unease, my uncle remained seated, signaling Aunt Veronica and Eliza to stay as well. When the room had emptied except for the 4 of us and Thomas, Philip leaned forward, all pretense of civility abandoned. What exactly do you think you're doing? He demanded. You know nothing about this business, nothing about the complexities of managing a project like Westside Harbor. You're right, I conceded. I don't. Which is why I need accurate information, not sanitized presentations. Information can be dangerous in the wrong hands, Aunt Veronica said, her tone gentler but no less condescending. The Westside Harbor situation requires delicate handling. The situation, as you call it, requires transparency and immediate action, Thomas countered. Harold recognized that before he died. It's why he made the decisions he did. Eliza gave a sharp laugh. Oh, please. He made Emma majority shareholder because he was a sentimental old man who saw his precious son, Robert, in her. It had nothing to do with business acumen. I absorbed the insult without flinching, focusing instead on the revelation beneath it. So, you all knew about the problems at Westside Harbor, and you've been actively concealing them? The guilty silence that followed confirmed my suspicion. Uncle Philip finally broke it with a frustrated sigh. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. The moment these issues become public, our stock will plummet. Partner companies will distance themselves, lawsuits will bury us. And your solution was to hope the problems would somehow fix themselves? I asked incredulously. Our solution, Aunt Veronica said with exaggerated patience, has been to implement targeted remediation while maintaining investor confidence. It's a delicate balance that your grandfather understood perfectly well. I thought of my grandfather's letter, his reference to the serious problems facing the company, and his belief that a fresh perspective was needed. Clearly, his faith in the current management team had faltered in his final months. I'd like to see all documentation related to Westside Harbor, I said, standing to signal the end of the conversation. Original engineering reports, remediation plans, current structural assessments, everything. Those files are restricted, Uncle Philip snapped. Not to the majority shareholder, Thomas reminded him quietly. My uncle's expression hardened into something ugly. This isn't over, Emma. The board can still vote to remove you for cause if your actions threaten the company's stability. Is that a threat? I asked, meeting his gaze steadily. It's business, he replied coldly. Something you know nothing about. As they left, Eliza paused at the door. You're in over your head, Emma. You always have been when it comes to the Morgan world. The sooner you accept that, the less painful this will be for everyone. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled shakily, the bravado I'd maintained, draining away. That went about as well as could be expected. Thomas gave me a appraising look. Actually, it went better than I anticipated. You forced the issue of Westside Harbor into the open. That's something no one has managed to do in months. They all knew, I said, still processing the implications. They've been actively covering up a potentially catastrophic problem. It's more complicated than simple concealment, Thomas said, gathering his papers. Your uncle and aunt genuinely believe they're protecting the company. In their minds, the gradual remediation approach might actually work if given enough time and resources. Will it? Thomas's expression turned grave. In my professional opinion? No. The issues are too severe and widespread. The current approach is like putting bandages on a patient who needs surgery. I sank back into my chair, the weight of responsibility suddenly overwhelming. So what do we do? If going public with the problems will destroy the company? It's not quite that binary, Thomas said. There are options between total concealment and public disclosure. But first, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with. He checked his watch. The project manager for Westside Harbor is expecting us on site in an hour. Seeing the situation firsthand will give you a better perspective than any report could. The drive to Westside Harbor took us through downtown and toward the formerly industrial waterfront that had been targeted for major redevelopment. Morgan Developments had acquired nearly 30 acres of prime waterfront property, with plans to transform abandoned warehouses and contaminated soil into a mixed-use community of luxury condominiums, boutique retail spaces, and high-end offices, all centered around a man-made harbor that would serve as a marina for private yachts. The project had been my grandfather's vision, his legacy development that would reshape the city's relationship with its waterfront. Billboards surrounding the construction site showed gleaming glass towers rising like crystal formations from landscaped grounds with sailboats gliding through the central harbor. Redefining waterfront living, the tagline proclaimed in elegant script. The reality beyond the billboards was considerably less polished. Construction equipment stood idle across much of the site. Workers clustered in small groups rather than engaged in coordinated activity. Chain-link fences surrounded areas where foundation work had begun, but now appeared stalled. A harried-looking woman in a hard hat and safety vest approached as Thomas parked in the designated visitor area. Mr. Chen, she greeted him with evident relief. Thank you for coming. Her gaze shifted to me with obvious curiosity. Julia Winters, meet Emma Morgan, Thomas said. Harold Morgan's granddaughter and the company's new majority shareholder. Julia's eyebrows shot up. Oh, we'd heard rumors, but... She recovered quickly, extending her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Morgan. Your grandfather spoke of you occasionally when he visited the site. This small revelation caught me by surprise. The idea that my grandfather had mentioned me in professional contexts when he'd rarely acknowledged me in family settings. Julia is our project manager here, Thomas explained. One of the few people who's been completely forthright about the challenges we're facing. Her expression tightened. And I've got the disciplinary notices in my personnel file to prove it. Your uncle doesn't appreciate messengers who deliver bad news. Show us what we're dealing with, Thomas prompted, handing me a hard hat from the car. For the next 2 hours, Julia led us through the troubled development, pointing out where design plans had been compromised to accommodate the unstable soil conditions. The central problem, as she explained it, was that the project had been designed without adequate geotechnical investigation of the site. The preliminary surveys indicated some contamination from the old industrial uses, which we expected, she explained, as we stood at the edge of what should have been the marina basin. I agree, but implementing such a shift would require overcoming significant resistance, not just from your family, but from investors who bought into the original vision. I thought about my classroom again, about how I taught students to present their creative pivots as evolutions rather than failures. What if we reframed it not as an admission of mistake, but as an innovative response to unexpected conditions? Not scaling back, but reimagining? Go on, Thomas said, his interest visibly piqued. The original plan was for a standard luxury development, essentially the same high-end condos and retail that every waterfront city has built in the past decade. What if we turned the limitations of the site into a feature rather than a bug? Created something that works with the unstable conditions rather than fighting against them? Such as? I hesitated, aware of how my idea might sound to an experienced developer. What if we designed the harbor area as a true wetland development? Floating structures, elevated walkways, buildings designed to move slightly with the unstable soil rather than requiring rigid foundations? Something that embraces the site's natural hydrology instead of trying to conquer it? Thomas didn't immediately dismiss the idea, which I took as a positive sign. It would be unconventional, certainly, but there are precedents, floating communities. In the Netherlands, elevated developments in flood-prone areas of Southeast Asia. And it would create a genuinely unique offering in the market, I added, warming to the concept. Instead of yet another interchangeable luxury development, we could create something truly innovative, a model for sustainable development in challenging conditions. Thomas leaned back, considering. It would require bringing in different architects, different engineers, starting essentially from scratch. Not entirely from scratch, I countered. The site preparation work is already done. The environmental remediation is underway. We'd be redirecting rather than restarting. Your uncle will fight it tooth and nail, Thomas warned. He's deeply invested in the current approach, both financially and emotionally. Then we'll need to build a compelling case that can't be easily dismissed, I said. Data, projections, precedents, market analysis. Everything needed to show that reimagining the project isn't just necessary but potentially advantageous. Thomas studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You know, when your grandfather told me he was making you majority shareholder, I thought he'd finally lost his legendary business sense. Now I'm starting to understand what he saw in you. The unexpected compliment caught me off guard. Let's not get carried away. I haven't actually accomplished anything yet, besides identifying problems everyone else was already aware of. You've done more than that, Thomas countered. You've started thinking about solutions rather than just containment. That's further than your uncle and aunt have gotten in months of knowing about the problems. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Eliza. Family dinner at the house tonight, 8 p.m. mandatory if you want to avoid all-out war. I showed the message to Thomas, who frowned slightly. Be careful. They'll present a united front designed to intimidate you into backing. Down. I've been dealing with their intimidation tactics my entire life, I said with more confidence than I felt. At least now I have some actual leverage. As I gathered my things to leave, Thomas offered a parting thought that would stay with me throughout the evening ahead. Remember, Emma, they need you more than you need them. Without your shares, they lose control of the company. Without their approval, you still maintain that control. Don't let them flip that power dynamic in their favor. The Morgan family estate sat on 3 manicured acres in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. The imposing colonial revival mansion had featured in architectural magazines and society pages for decades. Its perfect proportions and immaculate gardens, a physical manifestation of the family's public image. Flawless, traditional, and unyielding. As I drove through the wrought iron gates, memories washed over me. Awkward holiday dinners where I sat silently while my cousins monopolized the conversation with tales of their achievements. My grandfather's rare acknowledgments of my existence, always tinged with the unspoken comparison to my father's perceived failures. The subtle ways Aunt Veronica had of making me feel perpetually underdressed and unprepared, regardless of my efforts. Yet something felt different as I parked beside Eliza's gleaming luxury SUV. The house that had always intimidated me now seemed smaller somehow, its grandeur diminished by my new understanding of the insecurities and deceptions it contained. The family that had judged me my entire life was now facing judgment of their own, not just mine, but potentially the markets and the legal systems as well. With that realization came a strange sense of calm. I was no longer the supplicant, seeking approval but an equal party to a negotiation. Whatever happened inside those walls tonight would happen on different terms than ever before. The housekeeper who answered the door, a woman who had known me since childhood but always addressed me with formal distance, seemed momentarily flustered by my arrival. "Miss Emma," she said, the familiar address slipping out before she caught herself. "Ms. Morgan, they're waiting in the dining room." I thanked her and made my way through the familiar hallways, past portraits of Morgan ancestors and displays of expensive art that had always felt more like investments than objects of appreciation. The sounds of tense conversation grew louder as I approached the dining room. "Completely inappropriate to bring outsiders into confidential matters," Uncle Philip was saying as I entered. "I believe she's referring to me," Thomas Chen said, pleasantly from his seat at the table. I hadn't expected Thomas to be here, but his presence immediately shifted the dynamic in my favor. They wouldn't be able to present the unified front they'd planned with an outside witness present. "Emma," Aunt Veronica greeted me with forced warmth. We weren't sure if Thomas would be joining us for this family dinner. The emphasis on family wasn't subtle. Thomas, however, appeared entirely unruffled. "Emma asked me to attend as her advisor," he said smoothly. Given the technical nature of the issues facing the company, she felt it would be helpful to have someone with relevant expertise present for any discussions. Uncle Philip's expression darkened. "We have plenty of expertise at this table. I've been running Morgan Developments for 20 years. And yet Westside Harbor is on the verge of collapse, literally and figuratively," I said, taking the empty seat beside Thomas. "So perhaps some fresh perspective might be valuable." "Westside Harbor is a temporary challenge that we are managing appropriately," Aunt Veronica interjected, "which is what we wanted to discuss with you, Emma. Your approach today was concerning." "Concerning to whom?" I asked. "The executives whose bonuses depend on pretending everything is fine? The family members who approved a fundamentally flawed development plan?" Eliza set down her wine glass with excessive precision. "Careful, cousin. Your inexperience is showing. Complex business situations require nuance, not classroom simplifications." "Nuance is important," I agreed, refusing to be baited. So is honesty. I've spent today reviewing the West Side Harbor files and visiting the site. What I've seen isn't a temporary challenge. It's a potential disaster being papered over with increasingly desperate measures. And what would you suggest? Uncle Key, Philip asked with exaggerated patience. Publicly announcing that our flagship development has problems? Watching 40 years of reputation vanish overnight? Inviting lawsuits from every investor and partner involved? I would suggest, I replied carefully, that continuing down the current path guarantees failure, just in a more catastrophic form later. The foundation issues can't be solved with the current approach. The financial bleeding can't continue indefinitely. We need to reimagine the project completely. Reimagine? Aunt Veronica repeated incredulously. You mean abandon the vision your grandfather spent years developing? I mean honor his vision by ensuring its sustainability, I countered. The goal was to transform the waterfront into something extraordinary. The specific form that transformation takes needs to work with the realities of the site, not against them. I outlined the concept Thomas and I had discussed earlier, a development that embraced the site's hydrology rather than fighting it, creating something genuinely innovative rather than conventionally luxurious. As I spoke, I could see Uncle Philip's expression harden while Aunt Veronica's displayed growing dismay. Eliza, surprisingly, seemed to be listening with genuine attention. This is precisely why business decisions shouldn't be left to art teachers, Uncle Philip finally said. What you're proposing would require starting essentially from scratch, admitting the current design is flawed, and hoping the market embraces some experimental eco-concept instead of the proven luxury model. The current design is flawed, Thomas interjected. That's not a matter of opinion, but of engineering reality. The question isn't whether to change course, but how dramatically and how transparently. We've invested too much to change direction. Now, Aunt Veronica insisted. The marketing materials are printed. Deposits have been accepted for the residential units. Contracts are signed with retail tenants, all of which will become liabilities when the structures fail inspection or, worse, begin showing problems after completion, I pointed out. Better to disappoint people with a design change than endanger them with compromised buildings. This is absurd, Uncle Philip snapped, pushing back from the table. You've been majority shareholder for 2 days and already think you understand this business better than those of us who have dedicated our lives to it. I don't claim to understand the business better, I said, keeping my voice steady. But I do know that continuing to pursue a fundamentally flawed approach isn't good business by any definition. So, what exactly are you planning to do? Eliza asked, speaking for the first time since my presentation. Force through this reimagined design by fiat? Fire the current project team? Bring in your art school friends to redesign a $500 million development? Despite the sarcasm, her question was the first genuinely engaged response I'd received. I'm planning to commission a full feasibility study for an alternative approach, I answered honestly. If it proves viable, technically and financially, then, yes, I would advocate for a significant redesign. And in the meantime, Uncle Philip demanded, while this study is underway, construction costs continue to accumulate. Interest payments come due. Partner companies expect progress. The current remediation work can continue, Thomas suggested. It's necessary regardless of the final design, but new construction should pause until we have a clear path forward. Pausing construction will trigger penalty clauses in multiple contracts, Aunt Veronica pointed out. Less expensive than continuing to build what may need to be demolished, I countered. The conversation circled through the same points for another hour, growing increasingly tense. By the time dessert was served, an elaborate confection that no one touched, it was clear that no consensus would be reached. My uncle and aunt remained entrenched in their determination to continue the current approach, while I became increasingly convinced that a bold pivot was the only viable path forward. As the uncomfortable dinner finally concluded, Eliza followed, me out to my car, surprising me by asking to speak privately. "You're serious about this redesign concept, aren't you?" she asked when we were out of earshot of the others. "Yes," I replied simply. "I believe it's the only responsible option." She studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And if the feasibility study shows it's not viable? Then we'll need to find another solution," I said. But continuing down the current path isn't an option I can support. Eliza leaned against my car, arms crossed. "You know, I've spent my entire professional life preparing to lead this company. MBA from Wharton, management training programs, working my way through every department to understand the operations from the ground up." "I know," I acknowledged, unsure where she was heading with this. "And then Grandpa Harold just hands you controlling interest. You, who never showed the slightest interest in the business. You, who chose to teach finger painting instead of learning finance." The familiar insult lacked its usual bite, sounding more reflexive than intentional. "I understand why you're angry," I said carefully. "In your position, I would be too. But here's what I can't figure out," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "After visiting the site today and reviewing the files, you immediately identified the same problem I flagged 6 months ago." This caught me completely off guard. "You knew about the foundation issues?" "Of course I knew," she said with a hint of her usual condescension. "I've been working on the project team since planning began. I was the one who first suggested we might need to reconsider the entire approach when the soil testing came back. But your parents overruled me," she finished. "Dad said I was being overly cautious, that construction always involves challenges that get resolved along the way. Mom said changing course would be admitting failure, something Morgans simply don't do." I stared at her, recalibrating everything I thought I understood about the family dynamics. "Why are you telling me this now?" Eliza straightened, brushing an invisible speck from her immaculate blazer. "Because while I still think it's absurd that you're suddenly in charge, I care about this company. And if you're actually willing to make the hard call that my parents wouldn't, well, I might be willing to help." "Help how?" I asked cautiously. "I know this business inside and out," she said. "I know the partners, the contractors, the market realities. If you're serious about reimagining Westside Harbor, you'll need someone who can translate vision into viable business strategy." The offer seemed too convenient, too potentially a trap. "And what would you want in return?" A hint of the old. Eliza resurfaced in her smile. "Recognition, a significant role in the redesigned project. And eventually, when you inevitably get bored playing businesswoman and return to your construction paper and safety scissors, a path to leadership that acknowledges my capabilities rather than just my last name." I should have been offended by her characterization, but something in her demeanor suggested it was more habit than genuine disdain. Behind the polished facade and cutting remarks was someone who, like me, had been fighting for recognition within a family structure that had predetermined all our roles. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But I'd need to know you're actually committed to a new direction, not just finding another way to maintain the status quo." "Fair enough." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Grandpa told me once that the true test of a Morgan isn't how they handle success, but how they respond when everything falls apart. I think we're about to find out what we're both made of." As I watched her walk back toward the house, I realized that the landscape of allies and adversaries in this strange new world was far more complex than I had initially assumed. The family that had seemed so monolithically opposed to me contained its own fractures and dissenting perspectives. The cousin who had tormented me throughout childhood might now become an unexpected collaborator. Driving away from the estate that had always symbolized my outsider status, I felt the first glimmers of what might have been my grandfather's vision all along. Not just a test of my capabilities, but a catalyst for transformation that extended beyond balance sheets and building plans to the very foundation of the Morgan legacy itself. The next morning, I arrived at Morgan Developments before 7, determined to begin work on the feasibility study for reimagining Westside Harbor. The executive floor was deserted except for the security guard, who seemed surprised to see me, so early but handed over temporary access credentials without comment. I settled into what had been my grandfather's office, a space I'd never entered during his lifetime. The room reflected his personality perfectly, elegant but not ostentatious, with strategic views of both the city skyline and the harbor beyond. The walls displayed not family photos, but rather framed architectural renderings of Morgan Development's most significant projects. I noticed with a pang that none of my father's artwork was present, despite his considerable talent. My contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock. Thomas stood in the doorway, coffee cups in hand. "You're here early," he observed, setting one cup on the desk before me. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Too many thoughts about Westside Harbor, the family dynamics, everything." He nodded in understanding. "Any conclusions?" "Several, actually." I took a sip of the coffee, appreciating its warmth. "First, we need that feasibility study immediately, not in some bureaucratic timeframe of weeks or months. Second, we need to bring Julia Winters, the project manager, more centrally into planning. She understands the site constraints better than anyone. And third?" I hesitated, still uncertain about the conversation with Eliza. "I'm considering bringing my cousin into our working group." Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Eliza Collins? The same cousin who's been fighting your authority since the moment you inherited?" "She approached me after dinner last night. Apparently, she identified the Westside Harbor problems months ago, but was overruled by her parents." I studied Thomas's reaction. "You don't seem convinced." "I'm concerned it could be a strategy to undermine you from within," he said carefully. "The Collins family doesn't typically admit defeat so readily." "I don't think she's admitting defeat," I countered. "I think she's repositioning herself. Eliza has always been adaptable. It's how she survived in this family. She sees that the power dynamics have shifted and is adjusting accordingly. That doesn't mean her goals align with yours." "No," I agreed. "But her knowledge of the business operations could be invaluable. And keeping a potential adversary close enough to monitor might be wiser than leaving her free to work against us from the shadows." Thomas considered this. "It's your decision. Just proceed with caution." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Mr. Preston, the family attorney, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Ms. Morgan," he greeted me with formal courtesy. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but a matter has arisen that requires immediate attention." I gestured for him to take a seat. "What's happening?" "I've received notice of an emergency board meeting called by your uncle. The stated purpose is to vote on a resolution restricting the majority shareholder's unilateral authority on project decisions." His expression remained neutral, though I detected a hint of concern. "Essentially, they're attempting to prevent you from changing direction on Westside Harbor without board approval." "Can they do that?" I asked, looking between Preston and Thomas. "They can try," Preston replied. "The company bylaws include provisions for extraordinary circumstances where board consensus may override individual shareholder authority, originally designed to protect against a majority shareholder becoming incapacitated or making decisions that clearly harm the company." "And they're arguing that my plans for Westside Harbor would harm the company," I concluded. "Precisely. They're framing your proposed redesign as an inexperienced reaction that would trigger contract penalties, investor flight, and reputational damage." Thomas leaned forward. "When is this meeting scheduled?" 3:00 this afternoon. I felt a momentary surge of panic, quickly replaced by determination. So, we have less than 8 hours to build a case that convinces the board that continuing the current approach is more dangerous than changing course. Essentially, yes, Preston confirmed. Though I should note that your grandfather anticipated something like this might occur. In his final revision of the bylaws, he specified that such extraordinary measures would require a 3/4 majority of the board, not a simple majority. How many board members are there? I asked, realizing I didn't even know this. Basic fact about the company I now owned. 9, Thomas supplied. Your uncle, your aunt, 3 longtime executives who are deeply loyal to them, 2 independent directors with long-standing relationships to your grandfather, and me. The math was immediately clear. My uncle and aunt already had 5 votes they could count on. They needed 7 to reach the 3/4 threshold. So, they need to convince both independent directors, I said, thinking aloud. Yes, and they'll be lobbying them intensively, Preston warned. Dr. Watkins and Ms. Rodriguez respected your grandfather enormously, but they also have decades-long relationships with your uncle and significant financial interests in the company's stability. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. Okay, we need to divide and conquer. Thomas, can you pull together all the technical documentation on the soil issues and foundation problems? Engineering reports, remediation costs to date, projected expenses for the current approach, everything that shows the severity of the situation. He nodded. I can have that within 2 hours. Mr. Preston, I'd like you to prepare a brief on the legal liabilities the company would face if structural problems emerge after completion. Worst-case scenarios if we continue down the current path. Consider it done, the attorney replied, and I'll work on the alternative vision, the reimagined development concept that could turn this crisis into an opportunity. I stood, a plan forming in my mind. We'll meet back here at noon to integrate our findings before the board meeting. As they left to begin their tasks, I made an impulsive decision and called Eliza. She answered on the second ring, her tone wary. I need your help, I said without preamble. Your parents have called an emergency board meeting to try to strip my authority over Westside Harbor. There was a pause before she responded. I know. Dad called me this morning. And he wanted my support in approaching the independent directors, she said carefully. He thinks Dr. Watkins in particular would respond well to my concerns as the future of the company. I processed this information. What did you tell him? I said I needed time to consider the implications. Her voice revealed nothing of her thoughts. What exactly are you asking me for, Emma? Information, primarily. Who on the board might be receptive to a bold change in direction? What arguments would resonate with Dr. Watkins and Ms. Rodriguez? How do we frame this as protecting the company rather than disrupting it? Another pause. Meet me at Riverside Coffee in 30 minutes. This isn't a conversation for company phones. The coffee shop Eliza had suggested was equidistant from my apartment and the Morgan estate, neutral territory in more ways than one. When I arrived, she was already seated in a corner booth, 2 cups on the table before her. I ordered for you, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. Oat milk latte, right? The fact that she remembered my coffee preference after years of minimal interaction surprised me. Thanks, I appreciate you meeting me. Let's be clear about something, Eliza said, leaning forward slightly. I'm not doing this out of family loyalty or sudden cousin bonding. I'm doing this because I've spent the last 6 months watching my parents drive Westside Harbor toward disaster despite my repeated warnings. I understand, I assured her. This is about the company, not about us. Exactly. She took a sip of her coffee. So here's what you need to know about the board. Dr. Watkins, despite his long friendship with the family, is fundamentally a scientist. He responds to data, not emotional appeals. If you can demonstrate conclusively that the current approach is mathematically doomed to failure, he'll listen. And Ms. Rodriguez? Liability concerns, Eliza said promptly. She built her career on managing risk at Goldman Sachs. Show her the potential legal exposure if people move into structurally compromised buildings, and she'll be terrified enough to consider alternatives. I took notes as Eliza provided detailed insights on each board member's priorities, vulnerabilities, and decision-making patterns. Her knowledge was impressive, clearly the result of years spent studying the power dynamics of the company she'd expected to lead someday. "There's something else you should know," she said as our meeting drew to a close. "Dad has already drafted the press release announcing the board's vote of no confidence in your leadership. He plans to issue it immediately after the meeting, assuming he gets the votes he needs." The revelation should have angered me, but instead, it clarified my resolve. "He's that confident?" "He's that desperate," Eliza corrected. "The quarterly financials come out next week. If Westside Harbor's issues become public before they can implement containment measures, the stock will plummet. All the more reason for transparency now, rather than forced disclosure later." She studied me thoughtfully. "You really believe your reimagined harbor concept could work, don't you?" "I believe it has a better chance than continuing to pour money into a fundamentally flawed approach," I replied honestly. "And I believe innovation comes from embracing constraints, not denying them." An odd expression crossed her face, something almost like respect. "Well, in that case, there's one more card you might be able to play. Dr. Watkins has a particular fascination with sustainable development. His foundation funds research on climate-adaptive architecture. If your reimagined harbor incorporates those elements convincingly, it might appeal to him on a personal level, beyond the financial considerations." With that final insight, we parted ways, Eliza returning to whatever delicate balancing act she was performing between her parents' agenda and her own ambitions, me heading back to the office to prepare for the confrontation ahead. The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Thomas assembled a devastating technical analysis of Westside Harbor's structural issues. Mr. Preston delivered a sobering assessment of the legal liabilities involved. I worked with Julia Winters by phone to develop preliminary concepts for a reimagined development that would work with, rather than against, the site's hydrological challenges. By the time we reconvened at noon, we had the foundations of a compelling case. The current approach to Westside Harbor wasn't just flawed, it was demonstrably unsustainable from engineering, financial, and legal perspectives. More importantly, we had a viable alternative to propose, one that transformed crisis into opportunity through genuine innovation. "It won't be enough just to present the facts," Thomas warned as we refined our presentation. "Your uncle and aunt will appeal to tradition, to your grandfather's vision, to the family legacy. They'll frame this as you destroying Harold Morgan's final dream." "Then we need to reframe it," I said, an idea taking shape. "We need to connect this reimagined harbor concept directly to my grandfather's original vision. Not the specific architectural plans, but the underlying ambition to transform the waterfront into something extraordinary." Mr. Preston nodded slowly. "That approach has merit. Harold was known for innovation earlier in his career. Your proposal could be positioned as honoring that spirit rather than abandoning his vision." We were still refining our strategy when Patricia, the executive floor coordinator, informed us that the board members were beginning to arrive for the 3 o'clock meeting. One by one, they filed into the main boardroom. My uncle and aunt looking grimly determined, the 3 loyal executives carefully avoiding eye contact with me, and finally the 2 independent directors. Dr. Watkins was exactly as I'd imagined from Eliza's description. A distinguished academic type with thoughtful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ms. Rodriguez exuded the polished competence of someone accustomed to making high-stakes decisions without revealing her thoughts. Both greeted me with professional courtesy, but offered no hint of their inclinations regarding the vote ahead. Uncle Philip called the meeting to order with practiced authority. "We're here to address an urgent matter concerning the future of Westside Harbor, our flagship development." Recent events have raised concerns about potential changes in direction that could jeopardize the project's viability and the company's stability. He outlined the situation from his perspective, painting my proposed reassessment as a reckless abandonment of my grandfather's vision based on my artistic temperament rather than business reality. The narrative he constructed was skillfully designed to trigger exactly the response Eliza had predicted, portraying me as an impulsive dilettante whose inexperience threatened everything the company had built. When he finished, Aunt Veronica added her own perspective, emphasizing the marketing investments already made, the prestige partnerships established, and the potential reputational damage of changing course. The 3 executive board members followed with supportive statements, each reinforcing the narrative of disruption versus stability. Throughout their presentations, I maintained a calm demeanor, making occasional notes but otherwise offering no reaction. When the last of their arguments concluded, Uncle Philip formally introduced the resolution to require full board approval for any significant changes to the Westside Harbor Development Plan, superseding the majority shareholders' unilateral authority in this specific matter. He then turned to me with a thin smile. "Of course, Emma. You're welcome to present your perspective before we vote." "Thank you, Uncle Philip," I said, rising from my seat. Rather than taking a position at the head of the table as he had, I moved to stand beside the large windows overlooking the city. "Before I begin, I'd like to ask a simple question of the board. How many of you have actually visited the Westside Harbor site in the past 3 months?" The question clearly caught them off guard. Only Thomas raised his hand immediately. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Dr. Watkins acknowledged that he had not. Ms. Rodriguez likewise admitted her absence. The 3 executive board members exchanged glances before reluctantly indicating they had not visited recently. "What about you, Uncle Philip? Aunt Veronica?" My uncle's jaw tightened. "We receive regular reports from the project team. Physical presence is not necessary for proper oversight." "I disagree," I said quietly. "Understanding Westside Harbor requires experiencing it firsthand, seeing the continuous pumping operations, the cracked foundation elements, the compromised structural supports. Reports can be sanitized, reality cannot." I activated the presentation Thomas and I had prepared, beginning with unvarnished photographs of the site's current conditions, followed by the engineering data that demonstrated the severity of the soil stability issues. "The challenge we face isn't a matter of opinion but of physics," I explained, echoing Thomas's words from our earlier confrontation. "The current development plan fundamentally conflicts with the site's geological reality. No amount of remediation within our budget constraints can fully resolve these conflicts." I moved methodically through the financial analysis, showing how the continuing costs of the current approach would eventually exceed the project's potential revenue. Then came Mr. Preston's assessment of the legal liabilities if structural issues emerged after completion, potential damages that could bankrupt the company entirely. Throughout my presentation, I kept my tone measured and factual, avoiding emotional appeals or accusations. This wasn't about assigning blame, but about confronting reality and finding a path forward. The question before us isn't whether to change. "Course," I said, meeting the gaze of each board member in turn. "The physics and economics make change inevitable. The real question is whether we make that change proactively and strategically, or reactively after failure forces our hand." Dr. Watkins leaned forward slightly. "What alternative are you proposing, Ms. Morgan?" This was the opening I had been waiting for. I switched to the conceptual renderings Julia and I had developed overnight, preliminary sketches of a reimagined Westside Harbor that embraced rather than fought the site's hydrology. Instead of attempting to impose rigid structures on unstable foundations, we adapt our vision to work with the site's natural conditions, I explained. Floating structures anchored to secure points, elevated buildings with flexible connection systems, a development that celebrates its relationship with water rather than attempting to control it completely. As I outlined the concept, I emphasized, the innovative technological approaches that would be required, the kind of cutting-edge, sustainable design that Eliza had mentioned, would appeal to Dr. Watkins. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed him taking detailed notes. This approach would require significant redesign, Ms. Rodriguez observed. What about the existing investments, the contracts already in place? Some contracts would need to be renegotiated, I acknowledged, but the alternative is worse, continuing. Investments in an approach that engineering reality tells us cannot succeed, followed by much larger losses when failure becomes undeniable. Uncle Philip interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. This is precisely the kind of inexperienced reaction we feared, abandoning years of planning based on artistic sketches and hypothetical concerns. Not hypothetical, Thomas countered, speaking for the first time. The soil stability issues are documented fact. The foundation problems are measurable reality. Continuing the current approach isn't optimism, it's denial. For the next hour, the discussion circled through technical details, financial projections, and market considerations. Throughout, I maintained my focus on data rather than personalities, on solutions rather than blame. When Dr. Watkins or Ms. Rodriguez asked questions, I answered directly and substantively, acknowledging uncertainties where they existed while emphasizing the fundamental reality that drove my proposal. The current path was physically unsustainable. Finally, Uncle Philip called for the vote, his confidence visibly diminished but not extinguished. The resolution before the board requires a 3/4 majority to pass. All those in favor of requiring full board approval for any significant changes to the Westside Harbor Development Plan? My uncle, aunt, and their 3 loyal executives raised their hands immediately. 5 votes. Dr. Watkins and Ms. Rodriguez exchanged a long look before Ms. Rodriguez slowly raised her hand. 6 votes. All eyes turned to Dr. Watkins, whose decision would determine the outcome. He removed his glasses, polishing them deliberately as the room held its collective breath. I find myself in a difficult position, he said finally. I've known the Morgan family for over 30 years. I considered Harold one of my closest friends, and I've always respected the business acumen that built this company into what it is today. Uncle Philip's expression shifted toward triumph. However, Dr. Watkins continued, replacing his glasses, I am first and foremost a scientist. The data presented today regarding Westside Harbor's structural challenges is compelling and concerning. More significantly, the innovative approach Ms. Morgan has proposed aligns with sustainable development principles that I believe represent the future of urban design. He folded his hands deliberately on the table. I cannot in good conscience vote to restrict the exploration of an alternative that might not only save this project, but potentially position Morgan developments at the forefront of climate-adaptive architecture. My vote is no. The silence that followed was absolute. Uncle Philip's face flushed dark red. Aunt Veronica's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. The 3 executive board members studied their papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The resolution fails to achieve the required 3/4 majority, Thomas announced formally. The majority shareholder retains full authority regarding Westside Harbor's development direction. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Watkins approached me privately. Your grandfather and I spoke often in his final months, he said quietly. He worried that the company had lost its innovative edge, its willingness to adapt to changing realities. I believe he would have approved of your approach today, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. The validation from someone who had truly known my grandfather touched me deeply. Thank you, Dr. Watkins. I appreciate your support. I haven't guaranteed my support for your specific plan, he cautioned, only for your right to develop it properly. The concept has promise, but it will require rigorous testing and refinement before I would endorse it fully. Of course, I agreed. I welcome that rigorous evaluation. All I asked for today was the opportunity to explore a potentially better path forward. As the boardroom emptied, Uncle Philip remained seated, staring at the documents spread before him. I approached, cautiously, uncertain what to say but feeling some acknowledgement was necessary. "This isn't personal, Uncle Philip," I offered. "It's about finding the best solution for a difficult situation." He looked up, his expression hard. "You have no idea what you've done today. 35 years I've dedicated to this company. 35 years of building relationships, maintaining our reputation, preserving what your grandfather created." "And I respect that dedication," I said sincerely. "But preserving something sometimes requires allowing it to evolve." "Save the artistic metaphors for your classroom," he snapped. "This is business. Real people's livelihoods are at stake. Real investor money. Real consequences if your experimental approach fails. Real consequences if we continue down an unsustainable path as well," I countered. "I understand the risks. I'm not treating this as an art project." He gathered his papers abruptly. "We'll see, won't we? You've won this round, Emma. Congratulations. Now the real work begins. Turning those pretty sketches into functional realities while managing anxious investors, confused partners, and a workforce wondering if they'll still have jobs next month." His words were meant to intimidate, but they only reinforced my resolve. "Yes, that is exactly the work that begins now. And I would welcome your experience and insight in that process, Uncle Philip, if you're willing to offer it constructively." He didn't answer, simply walked out, leaving me alone in the boardroom that had witnessed the most significant professional confrontation of my life. Through the windows, I could see the harbor in the distance, the water reflecting the late afternoon sun. Somewhere along that shoreline lay Westside Harbor, no longer just my grandfather's final vision, but now my responsibility, my challenge, and potentially my legacy. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. We formed a special project, team combining Morgan Development veterans with outside experts in sustainable architecture and adaptive construction techniques. Julia Winters was promoted to lead the engineering aspects, bringing her practical knowledge of the site's constraints to every decision. Thomas provided strategic oversight, ensuring our innovative approach remained grounded in business reality. Most surprisingly, Eliza joined the team as our liaison with investors and partners, applying her MBA training and deep knowledge of the company's relationships to manage the delicate transition. Her involvement initially raised eyebrows, but her skill in framing our change direction as evolution rather than reversal proved invaluable. Whether her participation represented genuine belief in the new approach or simply pragmatic repositioning remained unclear, but her contribution was undeniable. Uncle Philip maintained professional distance, neither actively supporting nor openly undermining our efforts. Aunt Veronica gradually shifted from opposition to cautious engagement, particularly after several prestigious architectural publications expressed interest in our innovative approach to waterfront development. The 3 executive board members who had supported their position aligned themselves with the new direction with the fluid adaptability of career survivors. 6 months after that decisive board meeting, I stood at the edge of the Westside Harbor site, watching as the first prototype floating structure was carefully positioned in what would eventually become the central marina. The redesigned development was taking shape, smaller in scale than the original concept, but far more sustainable, both environmentally and financially. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Thomas said, joining me at the observation point. "Not just the design, but the courage it took to change course when reality demanded it." "I hope so," I replied, watching workers secure the innovative anchoring system developed specifically for our project. I still wonder sometimes if he knew what he was doing when he made me majority shareholder, if he somehow saw this potential outcome. "Does it matter?" Thomas asked. "Whatever his reasoning, you've proven his decision right." Before I could respond, I noticed Eliza approaching across the construction zone, tablet in hand, engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation. Over the past months, our relationship had evolved from antagonism to a wary professional respect. We would never be close in the conventional sense, but we had found a functional dynamic that leveraged both our strengths. "The Singapore investors are officially on board," she announced, ending her call as she reached us. "They're particularly interested in the floating retail concept. They see application potential for their own waterfront developments." "That's the third international development group to express interest in our approach," Thomas noted. "The innovation aspect is generating more positive attention than we anticipated." Eliza nodded briskly, "Which validates my marketing strategy perfectly. We're not selling luxury anymore. We're selling innovation, sustainability, and resilience." She glanced at me. Who would have thought an art teacher's perspective would translate so effectively to development strategy? The comment lacked her former derision, landing somewhere between genuine acknowledgement and habitual snark. I accepted it with the same spirit. "Creative problem-solving isn't limited to any one field," I replied. "Sometimes the most valuable perspective is the one that isn't constrained by traditional thinking." As we stood watching the construction activity, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months. I had entered Morgan Developments as an outsider thrust unexpectedly into power, facing a family that had never fully accepted me and a company on the brink of crisis. I would have been justified in walking away, selling my shares, and returning to the classroom that had always been my natural habitat. Yet something in my grandfather's belief in me, in his recognition of qualities I hadn't fully recognized in myself, had resonated deeply. The challenge he had presented wasn't just about saving a troubled development or preserving a family business. It was about finding the courage to reimagine possibility when reality demands transformation. That lesson, I realized, was one I would carry forward regardless of where my path led next. Whether I eventually returned to teaching full-time or continued diving deeper into this unexpected business role. The ability to see potential where others see only problems, to adapt rather than deny when foundations prove unstable, to transform constraints into catalysts for innovation. These were skills that transcended any single profession or context. "We should head back," Eliza said, checking her watch. "The board presentation starts in an hour, and the quarterly numbers deserve a proper introduction." As we walked toward the waiting company car, I took one last look at the evolving development. It wasn't what my grandfather had originally envisioned, but I believed it honored his legacy more authentically than rigid adherence to plans that no longer aligned with reality. Sometimes, the truest inheritance isn't the specific vision, but the courage to adapt that vision when circumstances demand it. In the end, that was what he had really left me. Not just majority control of Morgan Developments, but the confidence to trust my own perspective even when it diverged from established paths. That gift, far more than any financial inheritance, would shape whatever came next in my unexpected journey from excluded heir to transformative leader. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.